Hello and welcome to this episode of the Beyond podcast and this live After the Fall discussion panel. A discussion following a performance of A Mirror for Magistrates, or The Fall of Richard II, recorded live at the Key Theatre on Thursday the 11th of April 2024. The show can already be heard on the podcast, but here you get the follow-on discussion with Professor Thomas Betteridge, Dr. Harriet Archer, and Dr. Stephen Longstaffe, with readings by Liza and Valentina Vinci. So, over to past Robert and the live post-show discussion. After the Fall.
Hello, welcome to the second half of the show. Welcome to this After the Fall panel discussion of the fall of Richard II, as we presented it here from a Mirror for Magistrates, and we have a wonderful panel here to discuss the text, discuss some of its context, discuss everything around it. I'm your host, Robert Crighton. I run the Beyond podcast. Always try to remember that shtick. I sometimes forget. So, to introduce themselves and to go along the line, we have a bit of a general question to ask, which is, if there was a figure from history you could conjure up as a ghost, who would it be?
Hi everyone. My name's Professor Tom Betteridge. The two ones I did think about. I'd like to talk to Thomas More. And specifically, I'd like to ask him if Utopia was a joke or not, because that's a kind of big discussion. But the other one, actually, if I'm really honest, is Anne Boleyn, because I think that there's such historical discussion and debate, and and actually what we know about her is based on such a small amount of information. It would be really interesting to actually get a chance to talk to her. So those are the two I would go for.
Hi, I'm Dr. Harriet Archer. When Rob asked us this question a couple of weeks ago, I thought, oh yeah, that sounds fun. I still can't decide. I don't know. But I was thinking, who do we need back, And it's got to be Baldwin, hasn't it? Or possibly Ferrers, to ask him exactly how much of this is real and how much is in Baldwin's imagination. But I'd love to hear what he made of Liz Truss.
I wasn't asked this in advance, so...
You were in the email chain and everything.
How about Ricky III, Richard III?
Oh, and did he kill the two princes?
Well, it'd be interesting to have him speak for himself. There's a figure of some notoriety. For somebody who reigned for such a short time, I would really be interested in what it felt like to be at the end of that long period of kind of low-level civil war, when everyone sort of must be running out of steam. What does it feel like to get to 1480, whatever it is? So almost anyone from that time, what is it to live through that for such a long time? And Richard III would be as good a person to ask about that as anyone, I suppose.
And who are you?
Dr. Stephen Longstaffe. I was here last year for the Richard III show. My special area actually is drama about Richard II's reign. So I'm hopefully going to be talking a little bit about that later on. But I'm retired, which is why I look so happy.
And also reading excerpts tonight will be Liza and Valentina Vinci, who, I say we don't quite know whether you're reading any extracts tonight. We kept discussing this earlier. We've got all these extracts we might read, and they sort of go, we might not do that one. So hopefully you will hear their voice, and they will say some things. We are back in the sort of the 1550s sort of area. This is when this book comes into being, this moment in time. So I'll start with Professor Betteridge. What's going on?
So I think one of the things which is very interesting about the Mirror of Magistrates is that, for us now it's part of a canon of Tudor literature and it fits in. I think it's really important to bear in mind quite how traumatic the mid-Tudor period is. And I think we need to notice that. So 1546, Anne Askew, is martyred. She's also tortured. One of the things to notice about this period is that it's one of the very few periods in English history where torture is part of the judicial system. In fact, it isn't part of the judicial system. There's constant complaints about it. But this Reformation period, the period that Baldwin's working in, is one of the few moments where torture is something which happens in England. Not horrible executions, that happens all the time, but actual torture. So then we have 1547, Henry dies, Edward succeeds. Remember, Edward is a minor, so he has to have a protector. 1549, we have two rebellions. We have the Cornish Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion. And I think in terms of mirror, it's worth bearing in mind that in some metrics, 1549 is a peak for printing, which is only then surpassed in 1640. Now, we all know what happens in 1640, 1642. That's the English Civil War. Okay, so Mirror for Magistrates is very interested in the relationship between history and text and textual things and print, and Baldwin's very interested in that. So we have that. We have Somerset falls, Northumberland takes over. And this period when Baldwin's writing, which is the reign of Edward VI, it's a period of real Protestant radicalism. Okay, 2 Protestants, Anabaptists, are burnt by a Protestant government in this period. Okay, not during Mary Tudor's reign, where it's Catholic monarch burning Protestants. This is a Protestant regime executing people for being too extreme, too radical. There are discussions. They don't get as far as Parliament, but there are discussions about whether or not there should be an introduction of stoning to death for adultery for women. So this is a really radical moment. Then, of course, 1553, Edward dies, Mary succeeds, and you have, this incredible, really very intense, even in European terms, really intense persecution of Protestants. Lots of people being burnt alive. And all of this is the background to Mirror of Magistrates. Now, in the sense, when you read the text, it doesn't in some ways feel as if it's there, but it emphatically is there. Because all of these changes profoundly impact upon what it means to be a magistrate. In other words, what it means to be one of the people who is ruling England. Okay? So the final thing I would say, and I think it's really important to notice, is Mary and Elizabeth, they can't both be legitimate. Henry's married to their mothers at the same time. The succession at this time is set by House of Parliament. There's a law passed which says succession will be Edward, Mary, Elizabeth. Okay? So what it means to be a monarch at this time, although the Tudor regime spends a lot of time obscuring this, is totally up for debate. And the Mirror for Magistrates, the way it talks about what it means to be an officer, is very much part of an extremely live political debate, which can be, and in Mirror for Magistrates sometimes is, extremely radical. It kind of hides it a bit. One of the things about moving back to the War of the Roses, Richard II and all of that, is that's a kind of safe move. Let's talk about that history. But at the same time, it clearly, it's much safer to do that than to talk about what's happening now. But it also is applied to the present day. So it's a very, very heavily political text, I would say.
Any follow-up from on that from the rest of the panel before I have some thoughts? But I always have some thoughts. Anyone want to leap in before I have thoughts? Everyone's just smiling and nodding at me. That's what they do. It's interesting. For the podcast, we have spent a certain amount of time reading dialogue texts, some of which are from Edward's reign, where you have these very explicit discussions of what's going on theologically, but also that sense of, well, where are these texts coming from? Who's printing them? Where are they? How are they entering the country? And quite vigorous debate. And we're looking at a text where Baldwin doesn't go out the first time. And Baldwin, I think we should probably ask the question of where does Baldwin land in the confusion of the Reformation and the various confessions that are available, and also again, for the confusion of what's going on, that evangelical positions are not everybody agrees. There isn't a Protestant orthodoxy. There are competing factions going on there as well. So where does Baldwin land? And his mates as well, because this is the... Hopefully we got across to you this sense of... There were in theory, about 7 people, in theory, in this room, sitting down and writing this book. But where are they fitting in with that?
Baldwin is a really shadowy figure. We don't actually know very much about him at all. We think that he possibly is Welsh. He hints in one of the editions of this text that his ancestors may have been Welsh. We never know whether to believe Baldwin or not, so that may or may not be true. But that's kind of it, really. We know that he's born in the late 1520s, and so he's probably around 10 when the Reformation happens. So he's Protestant. We know that he's Protestant. He's not the most radical Protestant that you'll ever meet. He's sort of intellectually and politically Protestant, if that's a way to put it, rather than kind of religiously so. But he's knocking around in the 1540s, working as a printer's assistant. So he's assistant to the printer Edward Whitchurch, who's one of the major Protestant printers of this period, and who's printing really important kind of seminal Protestant texts like the Bible, the metrical Psalter, things in English for the first time. So he's a really big deal. Baldwin comes on the scene first writing dedicatory sonnets. His is one of the first English sonnets in print. As it happens, he's responsible for numerous firsts, like his novel, Beware the Cat, is the first English novel. And he gradually kind of gets more and more into this writing lark as the 1540s and 50s progress. He's working with Ferrers for entertainments for Edward VI's court by the early 1550s. So he becomes incredibly important, even though he comes from really very modest origins. And you can hear that kind of chafing a little bit, I think, in some of the complaints that we heard about, how noble a lot of these characters are and where exactly the relationship between nobility and notability, kind of how that works, who's worth talking about, and has that got a relationship to how noble they are? Can these noble figures fall, if they come of these noble families that we hear about? Evidently, yes, they can. So, Baldwin is working for Whitchurch, who, because he's such an incredibly important figure in the kind of print side of the Reformation and of English Protestantism, has to leave the country when Mary becomes queen. He can't stick around. And so Baldwin loses his job working for Whitchurch and instead starts working for a Catholic printer called John Wayland. Wayland is already engaged in printing, as we heard, Lydgate's Fall of Princes, and Baldwin is kind of along for the ride. And when they come up with the plan of extending the Fall of Princes up to the present day, Baldwin, it seems, says, yes, he'll have a hand in that. That comes across as quite a conservative project, I think, really, just extending a very lengthy and quite repetitive history of back to sort of classical and biblical times up to Mary's reign. It's a bit like a project like The Crown, say, or Downton Abbey or something like that, that kind of just retells history over the course of the foregoing century. But as we've seen, Baldwin, it seems, spies an opportunity to do something a bit interesting with this history and to turn it into a political commentary on not just nobility and magistrates, rulers under Mary, but going back further than that as well. In this particular text, he's not necessarily being anti-Catholic. Again, this isn't necessarily a confessional kind of division, but he's heavily critiquing some of Mary's official advisors and the things that she allows, I suppose, to go on as a result of those confessional tensions. So, as we heard earlier, Baldwin's first pass at the Mirror for Magistrates is suppressed. Possibly luckily for Baldwin, actually. It doesn't have a very catchy title. It's called A Memorial of Such Princes as in the Time of Rich, and it goes on and on and on, this great lengthy title. Luckily, in 1558-59, a much more savvy printer called Thomas Marsh comes on the scene and says, we're going to call this Mirror for Magistrates, and it becomes incredibly popular, but only once it's safe for it to be issued to the public. And it comes out in kind of dribs and drabs, because even under Elizabeth, it's still considered a bit too contentious to kind of rush it all out straight away. So we get this first edition, which we heard bits of today, in 1559, the year after Elizabeth comes to the throne, then a bit more in 1563, a bit more in 74 and 5, a bit in 78. And then because it becomes so popular, lots of other people kind of take up the story, which we can maybe talk about later on. So Baldwin somehow gets away with the very critical things that he has to say. But with this and many of his other publications as well, they have to be hidden. Hidden under the mattress, I think, is the way that I think of it, because they all come out again once Mary's died, and it's kind of safe for him to voice these contentious views once again.
Yeah, my notes here is just, when is history not political? I mean, when we were here last time, we were looking at various histories of Richard III and the various sort of, shall we say, propaganda aspects that certain families were pushing certain angles and what is the idea of history. So he's attempting to write a history. It's not a safe thing to do. Some people come very badly unstuck by writing about history. What other literature's about at the time as well? So as we come into the early years of Elizabeth, what are the big books out there? This isn't a prepared question. I just thought I'd throw that out there. Put everyone on the spot.
Can I say something about what Harriet just said, by the way?
Yes, please do.
Because I thought it was absolutely right. And I think one of the things is worth remembering is that there's as much a division between people who you could refer to as godly, i.e. both godly Protestants, broadly Catholics, in terms of both groups are very fed up with the group in the middle, who are probably the majority. Okay, so you have, for want of a better word, godly Protestants who then become Puritans, you have godly Catholics who become very committed to the Counter-Reformation, but you have a large group of people in the middle who may be Protestants and may be Catholics, but who are much less confessional, which is what the word you use. It's really important to have that sense of that distinction, because someone like Baldwin, it clearly is, by any way you define it, a Protestant, but equally is not what you would refer to, or I would regard as a kind of evangelical, godly Protestant, pushing for certain hard lines. So there's a second division going on, as it were. And in a strange sort of way, in some ways, both of the godly lot are more cross with the bit in the middle, who won't commit, as they are with each other. They're kind of both groups are saying, can you believe this hopeless lot in the middle who won't commit to either side?
And Baldwin does have really rude things to say about Catholics. I mean, we don't want to ignore that. He writes a text, or translates a text called The Wonderful News of the Death of Paul III, which, is very kind of explicit about the ways in which the Pope is being punished for what he's done. But yeah, that's not kind of at the heart of his contentions, I suppose, in as far as the Mirror is concerned. And I think that he's more interested in ways in which Catholicism feels intellectually unstable, I think, to him, than the confessional differences, which are kind of secondary. Although I think he feels that there's something a bit silly about some of the things that Catholics do, having not kind of grown up in that tradition. But you will have heard kind of hints of this, I think, through the text that we've heard this evening, where he's talking about how history can be kind of tested and pinned down, and whether people's accounts can be verified. And for him, Catholicism rests on unwritten verities. This is his and lots of other authors of the time's kind of big phrase. And for Baldwin, if you can't kind of pin it down to an existing text, then there's something really very dubious about it. Although, as we've also heard, he doesn't really believe that text is stable either, and he's constantly thinking about the ways in which, textual accounts can be kind of shifty. And I think that's what sort of draws him to the project of the Mirror, because first-person testimony seems, I think, to him to be both the problem and also the remedy, I guess, for that problem. That on the one hand, everyone has a different perspective, and so you can't really trust, one individual's account of what history, how history happened. But on the other hand, if you get enough of them together, maybe you can start kind of turning the situation around and looking at it from different angles. And I think that's what becomes so interesting to other dramatists later on.
Yes, we hopefully demonstrated when it was going. I think in fact there are two competing sources when Ferris is sort of they're having that argument in the text, and it's the fact you have these presentations, but you also have the editorial meeting. I'm really fond of the editorial meeting. You may have noticed in the show, and you're talking about how he's sort of prodding Catholicism because of course he has written a book called "Beware the Catholic." You might call it Beware the Cat. So, which again moves us in that sort of what other literature is about. Not
He's
just
going to keep asking that question.
We obviously have Beware the Cat, but what other things might be about?
So there's the two key things in Mary's reign. Tottel's Miscellany, very important text, collection of sonnets, bringing a whole bunch of Henrician sonnets together and publishing them. And then another really important thing is the collected works of Thomas More. They're published under Mary. There's a real growth. Again, certainly there's a Life of More and there's a Life of Fisher published at this time, or at least written at this time. So there's an interesting biography, which of course may feed into Mirror of Magistrates. And then there's a whole bunch of sort of allegorical and poetic texts. So both under Edward and Mary, although it's talked about as a drab age, there's actually quite a large set of publications, both original, but also, interestingly, pulling together sort of cultural things, like Holinshed pulls together the chronicles. You could argue that Mirror of Magistrates is a kind of compendium which pulls together a whole bunch of texts and bits and pieces, I think quite deliberately. And of course, Acts and Monuments is a massive pulling together of texts.
Yes, Acts and Monuments, which is our next sort of cue. In your local church, what volumes will you be finding in early Elizabeth reign?
Every single cathedral church has to have Acts and Monuments. Every single church has to have the paraphrases of Erasmus. And that's a really interesting reflection of the status of the Elizabethan, because Erasmus is a Catholic, although he's condemned by the Catholic Church. So he's on the index. So they condemn him, but he actually is clearly not a Protestant. And the New Testament paraphrases of Erasmus, along with the Bible, are the two texts you have to have in every parish church. You have to have a copy of the Acts and Monuments in every single cathedral.
For the listeners at home, the audience, what is the Acts and Monuments?
So Acts and Monuments is a book by John Fox. Interestingly, it's the book that the late Ian Paisley was going to have on Desert Island Discs. Just have that out there. It's a very, very big book. There's 3 English editions, 1563, 1570, 1583. It's a story, allegedly, certainly by the time it gets to 1570, of the church from the New Testament, and it's a story of persecutions of, as Fox puts it, true believers. So it goes right through, but it kind of picks up with the Lollards. And it has a massive collection of dialogues, of testimonies. So it has Anne Askew's testimony. It takes straight from the printed text and puts into Acts and Monuments. It has a lot of dialogues, an awful lot of dialogues. And it has, and it's interesting to talk about violence of some of the Mirror of Magistrates, it is full of very, very dramatic and very moving woodcuts of people being burnt alive. The Cambridge edition is coloured in. So is this been coloured in with watercolour almost certainly around about the time. And it is incredibly powerful woodcuts running all the way through it, particularly the second half, which is the Henrician and Marian persecutions. So it's a very, very powerful book, and it's a version of history, of course, which is very different from Mirror of Magistrates, because the people who appear in Acts and Monuments are the church leaders, so Cranmer, people like that. But also, and this is very relevant for where we are now, it's the other people who get persecuted and executed, which in this period are the working class and the artisans. So it's the church leaders who get executed to start with, and then they kind of miss out Baldwin's lot and the magistrates, and they go straight to, so Colchester, a whole bunch of, it's difficult to what term to use, artisans, working class people are persecuted. Unlike Mirror of Magistrates and most Tudor history, Acts and Monuments is full of the testimony and the words, printed often as dialogue, of very lower class people, men and women.
We have a little bit of acts of monuments. In fact, we actually have rather a lot of acts of monuments, but we'll stop Liza when everyone starts waving. So, Liza, could you give us a little bit of the text of acts of monuments to give you a flavour of this?
So this is just so this is massive bit of acts of monuments. At the very end, and this is how it relates to Mirror of Magistrates, Fox goes through a list of all the bad things that happened to persecutors. And unlike in Mirror of Magistrates, as far as Fox is concerned, God is literally working through in effect, a kill list of all the bad people. This is the account of some of the things which happens to them.
First, it talks about Stephen Gardiner, the arch persecutor of Christ's church, of whose poisoned life and stinking end, for so much as sufficient hath been touched before, I shall not need here to make any new rehearsal thereof. After him dropped away other also, some before the death of Queen Mary, and some after, as Morgan, Bishop of St. David's, who, sitting upon the condemnation of the blessed martyr Bishop Ferrer, and unjustly usurping his room, not long after was stricken by God's hand after such a strange sort that his meat would not go down, but rise and pick up again, sometime at his mouth, sometime blown out of his nose, most horribly to behold, and so he continued till his death. Where note, moreover, that when Master Leighton, being then sheriff at Bishop Ferrer's burning, had fet away the cattle of the said bishop from his servant's house called Matthew Harbottle into his own custody, the cattle coming into the sheriff's ground, divers of them would never eat meat, but lay bellowing and roaring, and so died. This foresaid Bishop Morgan above mentioned also bringeth me in remembrance of Justice Morgan, who sat upon the death of the Lady Jane, and not long after the same fell mad, and was bereft of his wits, and so died, having ever in his mouth, Lady Jane, Lady Jane, Lady Jane.
Rinse and repeat for several volumes. These things are all sort of bouncing around in print culture. Mirrorlands, variously. What sort of impact does it have? What happens because this book has come into existence and people presumably read it?
Well, what immediately happens, I guess, is that more of it keeps coming out. I think a bloke called John Higgins jumps on the bandwagon pretty quickly. He's also working for Thomas Marsh. Marsh obviously sees an opportunity, a gap in the market, and in common with lots of other projects that are going on at the time, not least Acts of Monuments, the prequel and sequel and kind of extensions and expansions are really big business at this point. Whether it's true or not, lots and lots of texts are printed with the words, newly expanded, newly amended on the front, so that you go into the bookshop and you say, aha, I haven't had that one yet, and I'll get that too. So Higgins dives in and adds the first part of the Mirror of Magistrates, which starts off with Brutus's arrival in Albion, way back before records begin. And this is a big part of what Higgins is trying to do, actually. He's talking about how there is no record of English history that far back, and so he's going to kind of plug the gap. But what's extraordinary about it is that his characters, when they get kind of conjured up, they're so old that some of them can't remember how to speak, and they sort of stand there kind of stammering for a bit before anything comes out. But that passes quickly, and then they get going, and this whole thing kind of rolls on and on and on. In 1578 is the second part of the Mirror of Magistrates, a guy called Thomas Blennerhassett, totally unrelated to the original project, nothing to do with Thomas Marsh, but he also sees a gap, a literal gap of the conquest this time, and he throws in a bit about William the Conqueror and various kind of Saxons and things like that. And then ultimately all of this gets pulled together in 1587 by Higgins and Marsh again, this time printed not as a Mirror of Magistrates, not as the first part of the Mirror of Magistrates or the last part of them, all these different permutations, but just as the Mirror of Magistrates. And this is the big edition of everything, apart from Blennerhassett's, we don't talk about him, from Baldwin through Higgins, but the other way around, because they put it in chronological order, which, as we heard this evening, is a contentious thing for Baldwin, who his contributors are just too enthusiastic and they dive straight in without any concern for chronology. So 1587 is critical because this is the edition which comes out just as Marlowe and various other people are kind of, winding up in terms of their careers writing history, plays, and other tragedies. And so this is where the Mirror starts to infiltrate kind of wider culture. And, I mean, As someone who works on the mirror, I see it everywhere. So I find it impossible to talk about Elizabethan literature without saying that is the mirror's responsibility. I'm sure that's not necessarily true, but you see its influence in the way that fortune is discussed, and what we could think about in reasonably kind of simplistic terms previously as a question of you do something bad and you are punished by providence. The mirror turns that inside out by showing us all of these different tragedies which, yes, these characters might all be punished by fortune or providence, but in completely different ways. Once we start unpacking why each of these characters who we looked at this evening dies, they're not all guilty in the same way. Some of them are guilty of, thinking bad thoughts and being enabled by other people. Some of them are guilty of kind of exploiting their position, but not necessarily doing anything bad themselves. And then their punishments are all very varied as well. So some of them are punished horribly. We hear in great detail about the physical kind of torture and destruction of the physical bodies of lots of these characters. I think, drawing on what Tom said about Acts and Monuments and that kind of graphic violence that we hear about there. But then you've also got Mowbray, who's punished, his terrible punishment for the awful things that he does is having to go and live in Germany where they wear frilly outfits. I mean, it's,
That is
it's
pretty
really
bad. Well, I think
He was very upset by that.
He was, and all that swearing and drinking. So, I think this idea that cause and effect, providential cause and effect, is not as simple as it appears, and that, history can be kind of tricksy in these ways, filters into a lot of the texts which pick up the mirror's themes. And that idea of kind of guilt and punishment being related to each other and then it is completely exploded, I suppose. It's also asking really important questions, I think, about just, why do bad things happen to good people, I guess, often? How do we account for that?
It relates very much to the condition of drama in that sense that we have all these multiple voices who have different agendas, who different bad things happen to them. Rather than just saying history is one thing after another, it's actually a series of things all happening at the same time, which I think is probably one of the reasons why so many playwrights go, because it's latching onto an emotional response to something that has happened to a person rather than here is a thing that happened over here, which is where we sort of move into the general direction of drama. Stephen, Richard II is fodder for many plays, two of which we will mention, one of which we will not. We've obviously very much danced around the character of Duke of Gloucester, Thomas of Woodstock. We have danced around various other characters who will pop in and out of frame. Yeah, Richard II on stage.
Richard II on stage. Well, we have references to Richard II plays that don't exist anymore. And one of the things about this stage of, say, the 1590s is you've got at least two companies going at any one time, and they do a different play every day. So the demand for material is absolutely ridiculous. So we have lots and lots of evidence of multiple plays upon biblical subjects, historical subjects. There are several Henry V plays in the records we have, and we don't have that much. But we do have three existing plays dealing with sort of three stages in that king's life. And the final one is quite Mirror for Magistrates, because that's the kind of last act. And the life of Richard in different aspects remains intensely topical, because we're coming to the end in the 1590s, we're coming to the end of the reign of Elizabeth, and people's thoughts turn to succession. Who's going to become the monarch afterwards? What's going to happen? And Richard II becomes a kind of keynote for usurpation, because Richard II is deposed and Bolingbroke becomes king and Richard is murdered. And one of the things that happened around that towards the end of Elizabeth's reign is somebody writes a history of Henry IV. It's really the end of Richard II's reign, and he ends up in the Tower, because it's a very, very sensitive area. So the end is a hot topic. There's a kind of conspiracy of various nobles, and the night before they take to the streets of London, they commission a performance of a certain play at the Globe. There's your clue. And then the next day they rise, and Elizabeth is famously supposed to have said, "I'm Richard II. Don't you know that?" We have two plays on the earlier parts of Richard's life. The first part is that Richard, in Richard's reign, when he was 14, something called the Peasants' Revolt happened, 1381. And we have a play about the Peasants' Revolt. We have a whole play about the Peasants' Revolt. So the Mirror for Magistrates is not at all like Acts and Monuments, and the Acts and Monuments makes space for the voices of men and women from lots and lots of different points of society. The Peasants' Revolt is the founding moment of what you might call an English radical tradition. It's returned to again and again and again and again. Because behind the Peasants' Revolt in the chronicles that we have is a sermon by a priest called John Ball. And that sermon and that figure remain inspirational right through the 19th and 20th centuries. William Morris was a big fan, for example. Clement Attlee refers to it again and again. Richard rides out to meet the rebels at the age of 14 as their king. And when he's meeting the rebels, there's a kerfuffle, and the leader of the rebels is stabbed by the mayor of London, who's called William Walworth. And Richard makes all sorts of promises to the rebels that they will be fairly dealt with, and they all go, "Okay, we'll all go home." And guess what happens? They are not fairly dealt with. And they get some quite good scaffold speeches. So we've been listening to kind of ghosts reflecting on their whole lives. So Jack Straw shows a moment of extraordinary courage, effectively a boy, and then Richard goes off the rails.
And just to note, so the play we're talking about, The Life and Death of Jack Straw, can be listened to on the podcast now. We have recorded a full cast audio adaptation that is available for you to go home. I think there may even be a link in your programme. Mentioning that in passing.
One of the notable victims of the Peasants' Revolt was, of course, Simon of
Sudbury. Yeah, we got his head down the road. And he does feature in the play, The Life and Death of Jack Straw. The Archbishop mysteriously disappears halfway through the play and is never heard of again for reasons.
We have that's printed, and it's popular enough to be reprinted. We have evidence of a play called Richard II at the Globe, which is clearly not that play because it mentions the Peasants' Revolt. So we have evidence of multiple plays. We also have a play which we now call Thomas of Woodstock because it's a manuscript. We don't know if it was ever performed. And that deals with the downfall and death of Woodstock, Earl of Gloucester, one of the stories that you've heard.
Yes, you indeed. You died. It was very sad.
Yes, I know. Wasn't it sad? And one of the other main characters is Robert Tressilian, who is the Chancellor. And so what this play does, astonishingly, really, is it dramatises not merely the fall of somebody from high to low. Woodstock, appropriately gets a big deathbed speech. He's visited by the ghost of his father, that's very mirrorish. But we also have multiple scenes where the oppression of what's referred to in the play as the Commons, who have recently risen in the Peasants' Revolt. The country is in a kind of ferment. And a huge part of that ferment is not big dukes and earls with their, kind of levies. It is the average person, the common person, as it were. And we have some extraordinary scenes where Tressilian says, "I've got this amazing plan, Richard. You're broke, you've got to get some new clothes. We want to rebuild Westminster Hall. I've developed this thing called blank charters." He comes up with the idea of a blank check. So they go around with these kind of bits of sheepskin or whatever, get everyone to sign to them. They go, we'll fill in the sum later. And then we have an even more extraordinary set of scenes, which are to do with, there's a figure who attaches himself to Tressilian. Tressilian is a serious character. There's a figure called Nimble, who is a kind of trickster figure, who just makes mischief in quite a deadly way. And Nimble is behind all sorts of really petty but deadly persecutions of the common people. Well, the kind of surveillance that we associate with the present day. So privy whisperers, which is not people whispering in privies, but private whisperings about the monarch. So they go around collecting intelligence. They kind of have spies. They have their ears open. You even get to the extent where we have a scene with a schoolmaster who's kind of trying to express some kind of dissent to this without actually doing it. And he comes up with the idea of having a song, which is all about a villain. And then the next line is, God bless my Lord Tressilian. And so, no, we're not talking about Tressilian, because say, God bless my Lord Tressilian. And then there's another thing about this terrible villain. And then, God bless my Lord Tressilian. And this is obviously a subversive song, and it's so subversive that even if you're whistling it in the street, you can be taken, and you can be face the consequences.
And we have that scene now. So if I could ask Nimble and the whistler, Nimble, the henchman of Tressilian, to come up. So Nimble is there with. There are other people in the scene. We've simplified it. We've got Nimble, and we've got someone who does some whistling. So Nimble's chatting away to somebody else, and then the whistler appears.
Close again, Master Bailey. Here comes another whisperer I see by. Oh, villain! He whistles treason! I'll lay hold of him myself.
Ooh. Out, alas, what do you mean, sir?
Ah, rank traitor, Master Bailey. Lay hold on him, for he has most erroneously and rebelliously whistled treason.
Whistled treason? Alas, sir, how can that be?
Oh, very easily, sir. There is a piece of treason that flies up and down this country in the likeness of a ballad, and this being the very tune of it thou hast whistled.
Alas, sir, you know I spake not a word.
Oh, that's all one. If any man whistles treason, 'tis as ill as speaking it. Mark me, Master Bailey. The bird whistles that cannot speak, and yet there be birds in a manner that can speak too. The raven will call thee rascal, the crow will call thee knave. Ergo, he that can whistle can speak, and therefore this fellow hath both spoke and whistled treason. Who did set you a work? Oh, who was the cause of your whistling? Or did any man say to you, go whistle?
Not any man, woman, nor child, truly, sir.
No? How dost you whistle then? Or what cause has ye to do so?
Well, the truth is, sir, I had lost 2 calves out of my pasture, and being in search for them from the top of the hill, I might spy you 2 in the bottom here, and took ye for my calves, sir, and that made me come whistling down for joy in hope that I had found them.
Oh, more treason yet. He take a courtier and a bailey for 2 calves. To limber with him, he shall be quartered, and then hanged.
So that's a little bit of whistling treason from the play called Thomas of Woodstock. So any final thoughts?
I would say that what Harriet said was absolutely right about the importance of the mirror for Elizabeth. I think that one of the things that Baldwin does and his team do is kind of create a model which allows you to talk about history, which is much less boring than the Chronicles, because the Chronicles are really difficult to read and they have no framing to them. They're just year by year. So it's an incredible achievement from Baldwin to kind of create an idea or a way of importing some humanist ideas so that you talk about these people in humanist terms, but also within a narrative. And it's a kind of innovation which immediately gets picked up by the dramatists, because why would it not be? It's a way of talking about history which is accessible, but also still complex and interesting. So in some ways, Mirror for Magistrates is a bit like 16th century Raiders of the Lost Ark. Spielberg's brilliant, there's adventure and mysticism and a bit of romance all in one. It's a really clever, commercially clever thing to do.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I think there's just so much going on. I mean, we've barely scratched the surface of how brilliant The Mirror is, to be honest. I think something that captures that, I guess, just a little vignette is those arguments that Baldwin and Ferrers and the other contributors have about, what exactly is going on here? Where does this come from in the Chronicles? Who's right about this? Is it Fabian or Hall? There are lots of other instances of things like that going on, but that's only one layer of it. So another thing that we don't hear about from the fictionalized contributors is how the real contributors are changing historical fact as well, in addition to all of that. So Tresillian, for example, the way that he talks about working the law like wax, that really, evocative image, which I think conveys like a hint of, I don't know, admiration almost, or jealousy from Ferrers, who is a trained lawyer himself as well. He knows that this is bad, but he was good at what he did. But he wasn't. That wasn't him. In fact, Tresillian, he was punished for his crimes, but that was not among his crimes. And the people who in fact did that were trying to condemn a Protestant under Mary I, Nicholas Throckmorton, and they, in fact, were notorious in Baldwin's day for manipulating the laws and changing things according to the monarch's will. So none of this, in fact, is about Tresillian at all, but it's very specifically tailored to reflect much more recent history. So we've got these discussions about, who retells history, is it in the hands of the victors and so on? How much does it matter? That wonderful moment when Rob's like, does it actually matter at all? Which of the historians is right about this? But underneath all of that, there's more layers going on of exactly what Baldwin is up to. And Beware the Cat does that too in a hilarious kind of fashion. So the mirror is kind of the dark side of all of this. And then I'd really recommend going and reading Beware the Cat, which kind of satirizes all of the things that we've discussed, but in a kind of a slightly lighter. I mean, thinking about it now, there's quite a lot of grim things going on in Beware the Cat too.
There are a lot of grim. Bad things happen to
bad
cats.
Things happen.
But luckily, there is a recording of the Beware the Cat, which will be dropping to our patrons very soon. We recorded it last year.
To be clear, though, Rob, cats do some pretty bad things. I used to remember a cat hanging off someone's testicles.
Yeah, but he did deserve it.
Well, that is a bad thing.
Yes. But anyway, there will hopefully be a touring version that I'll be doing next year. So for all your cat evilness, will be available then. So final thoughts, Stephen, and then can you start an insurrection, please?
My final thought, I suppose, is not as an academic, but as a performer. And that was the experience of performing these poems. They're clearly written for the voice and for the ear. And that then makes me think about what poetry can do in a public and a political sense, because that speaks to me as a kind of poetry which is not a solitary, quiet reading experience. You may be solitary, but if you're voicing these things, that is a different political as well as personal situation. And I found that really interesting because they work so well for the voice. And the fact that they do is not accidental. It's not just because meter means it's got to be like this, I don't think. And I find that really, really fascinating, especially as we associate that sort of public voicing of politics with drama, but not with poetry. And I think one of the great things for me from this evening has been just made me think again about what poetry can do. Long poetry that has room to breathe, poetry that really incorporates narrative, but which is also a treat for the voice and a treat for the ear. This is not poetry, but I'll read it if you like.
Yeah,
okay.
Let's hear from Parson Ball from the life and death of Jack Straw, which is not unconnected with actual sources.
The great thing about having a drama about an insurrection or a rising, which is prompted by a sermon, is you've really got to have the sermon in it. And so somebody gets to say these words. Now they get executed. Everybody else loses. But these words are still spoken. Neighbours, the weakest nowadays goes to the wall. Mark my words. Follow the counsel of John Ball. England has grown to such a pass of late that rich men triumph to see the poor beg at their gate. I am able, by good scripture before you to prove that God does not this dealing allow, nor love. But when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman? Brethren, it were better have this community than to have this difference in degrees. The landlord's rent, the lawyer's fees, so quickly the poor man's substance is spent. Merrily with the world it went when men ate berries of the hawthorn tree. Thou help me, I'll help thee. There was no place for surgery, and old men knew not usury. Now 'tis come to a woeful pass. The widow, that hath but a pan of brass and scarce a house to hide her head, sometimes no penny to buy her bread, must pay her landlord many a groat, or 'twill be pulled out of her throat. Brethren mine, so might I thrive as I wish not to be alive, to see such dealings with extremity. The rich have all, the poor live in misery. Follow the counsel of John Ball. I promise you, I love you all, and make division equally of each man's goods indifferently, and rightly may you follow arms to rid you from these civil harms.
All that remains is to thank our wonderful panellists and readers for their contributions tonight. Thank you very much, everyone.
In this live After the Fall discussion panel were Professor Thomas Betteridge, Dr. Harriet Archer and Dr. Stephen Longstaffe, with readings by Liza and Valentina Vinci. Your host was myself, Robert Crighton. If you've enjoyed this work, there is a discussion of the book with its modern editor on the pod now, and there's more William Baldwin action in Beware the Cat, materials various, which I hope one day, fingers crossed, to actually tour soon. All these free things have links in the show description. Additionally, there are a host of exploring sessions with myself on A Mirror for Magistrates. The whole book. I read it all. It's taking forever. Available for £5 tier level patrons, but there is also a separate box set available for a one-off price. And more coming every month. Supporting us on any level on the Patreon is a huge help, so it would be lovely to see you there. There's even a free subscription tier to keep up to speed with developments. Patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare. Alternatively, you can support us on Ko-fi.com/Beyond Shakespeare and give us something as a one-off. And links to all these are, as ever, in the show description. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.